Okay, so this next video lecture is still part of the audit procedures and objectives topic in this module. So in this video lecture, we will be discussing about the auditor's responsibilities in conducting an initial audit engagement. Okay, so in conducting the initial audit engagement, the auditor should, with respect to the opening balances, he should obtain sufficient and appropriate audit evidences about the opening balances, whether they contain misstatements that are material, okay, and it has the effect on the current period's financial statements. So this may be due to the uncorrected material misstated in the prior period. Okay, this was uncorrected by the management. Another is when there is appropriate accounting policies reflected in the opening balances and whether these are consistently applied in the current period's FS, or if there are changes that was made, these are properly accounted for and adequately presented in the disclosures for adequately presenting those disclosures which are in accordance with the applicable financial reporting framework. Okay, so again, this will also be determined if the opening balances has any misstatements. Okay, so the auditor should read the most recent FS of the entity, okay, if there are any, and the predecessor auditor's report also for the information that is considered to be relevant to the opening balances. Okay, so he should evaluate these documents, okay, for the initial audit engagement and also in accepting the audit engagement with the entity. When there is a predecessor auditor, the successor auditor should request the management to authorize the predecessor auditor to allow review of the predecessor auditor's audit documentation. So we have discussed this actually in the uh, accepting of the audit engagement. Okay, so before the successor auditor would accept, he may evaluate or request the management to allow him to um, uh, check or read, okay, the predecessor auditor's documentation. Okay, so in obtaining sufficient appropriate audit evidence on whether the opening balances contain any material misstatements, so in this case, the auditor should determine whether the prior period's closing balances have been correctly brought forward, because closing balances from the prior period will be used as the opening balances in the current period. Okay, so this is also to determine if there are any misstatement that existed which were uncorrected by the management. So another is the auditor should also determine whether opening balances reflect the appropriate accounting policies. Okay, so again, this is to determine if there are also misstatements that existed in the prior period's financial statements or balances. And lastly is to evaluate whether the audit procedures performed in the current period provided evidence which are relevant to the opening balances. Of course, this is to make sure that opening balances are fairly presented. Okay, so that's why audit procedures performed is to mitigate any audit risk that is associated with this opening balances. Okay, so those are the responsibilities of the auditor when conducting the initial audit engagement. Okay, so in this video lecture, we will continue with the next topic in our module, which is about audit documentation. So this is the third topic. Okay, so we will just continue since the last part of the audit objectives and procedures is just a short topic to utilize the maximum time for our video lecture. Okay, for audit documentation. So here, when we say audit documentation, this is also known as working papers. Okay, so this referred to the record of audit procedures performed, relevant audit evidence obtained, and conclusions that is reached by the auditor. Okay, so meaning all of these things are being documented and kept for by the auditor. So in PSA 230, this is entitled Audit Documentation. So this particular standard requires that the auditor should prepare sufficient and appropriate audit documentation because this will provide evidence of the auditor's basis for his conclusion. Okay, so as mentioned earlier, whatever evidence that he may gathered, provided it is sufficient and appropriate, it will serve as a basis for his opinion. Okay, that's why he has to document such information or evidences. Okay, so of course, this is to achieve the overall objective of the auditor, that is to provide opinion or conclusion. Another is documenting this evidences or documents will also prove that the audit was planned and performed in accordance with PSA and the applicable legal and regulatory requirements. Okay, so because those who will check these things or document will know if indeed the documents and the procedures was followed by the auditor appropriately based on the standard. Okay, so furthermore, audit documentation provides sufficient and appropriate record of the basis for his report or conclusion, and this will assist the engagement team. Okay, this will assist the engagement team to plan and perform the audit. Okay, because these things are being documented. So aside from the evidences, the auditor will also document other things which are related also to the audit. Okay, another is it will also assist engagement team members who are responsible for supervision to direct and supervise the audit work and to discharge the review responsibilities in accordance with quality control policies and procedures. So again, this will help them to discharge and to perform their respective tasks because audit program and overall audit strategies will also be documented as well. Okay, another is it will enable the engagement team to be accountable for their work because whatever responsibilities they may have, it is documented also. And it will retain record of matters of continuing significant for future audit, okay? Especially if the auditor will be the same auditor for the next period's financial statements. Another is it will also, or audit documentation also enable an experienced auditor to conduct quality control reviews as well as inspection, and enable the experienced auditor to conduct external inspections in accordance with the laws, regulations, and other requirements based on those documentation. So our audit or the audit documentation should include the following. Okay, it will include the amount below which misstatements would be regarded as clearly trivial, meaning these are amount below which misstatements would be regarded, meaning there is some doubt or questions about these items. Okay, so therefore the auditor should document it for further audit procedures that he needs to perform, or he must communicate it with the management. Okay, another is all misstatements accumulated during the audit, and other than those that are clearly trivial, and whatever they have been, or whether they have been corrected. Okay, so any misstatements, and document also if they were corrected by the management. And lastly, audit documentation should also include the auditor's conclusions about whether uncorrected misstatements are material, individually or in aggregate, and the basis for that conclusion. Okay, so as we go along, there are other items also that should be included in the audit documentation by the auditor. Okay, so we will continue with the forms, contents, and extent of audit documentation to be done by the auditor. Okay, so an audit documentation may be recorded on paper, film, or on electronic or other medium. Okay, so examples of the audit documentation which will be included as well, aside from what we have mentioned earlier in the previous slides. So it will include the audit programs, analysis, issues, memoranda, summaries of significant matters, letter of confirmation and representation, checklists, correspondence concerning significant matters. So this is in addition with those items which we've mentioned earlier. Okay, so if appropriate, abstracts or copies of the entity's records may also be included as part of the documentation, but such documentation is not considered a substitute for the accounting records. So in this case, it is very important that the auditor will gather evidence based on the accounting records of the entity. Okay, so audit documentation should also record the following: the identifying characteristics of specific items or matters that were tested, because this is where the auditor has performed the audit procedures to gather audit evidences. Another is who performed the audit work and the date of such work was completed. Another is who reviewed the audit work performed and the date also and extent of such review. This is for inspection and evaluation of the supervisor among team members. Okay, so the quantity, type, and content of the working papers is a matter also of professional judgment by the auditor, but it should be sufficient enough to show that the accounting records agree or reconcile with the FS. Okay, because this is very important as part of the gathering of the audit evidences by the auditor. So the auditor's judgment about the form, content, and extent of audit documentation for a particular engagement, this will all ordinarily depend on the size and complexity of the entity, nature of the audit procedures that he will perform, the risk of material misstatement that was estimated or assessed, the significance of the audit evidence obtained, okay, the nature and extent of exceptions that was identified during the procedure, the audit methodology and tools that was used by the auditor. Okay. Another is the need to document a conclusion or the basis for his conclusion not readily determinable from the document of the work performed or audit evidence that was obtained. Okay, this will also be used as the basis for the form, content, and extent of his audit documentations. Okay, so working papers are designed and organized to meet the circumstances and the auditor's needs for each individual audit. So meaning there might be changes in the type and content or form of audit documentation from one audit engagement to another. So again, this will depend on the different factors that we've mentioned earlier in our previous slides. okay, that the auditor should include. Another is the use of standardized working papers may improve the efficiency with which such working papers are prepared, and this will also facilitate the delegation of work and will provide means to control its quality. So it's better to that the auditor should have a standardized working papers in which the team will be using in performing the audit procedures. Okay. So the auditor may also improve audit efficiency by utilizing schedules, analysis, and other documentation that is prepared by the entity. But then again, this is not a substitute, okay, for the auditor's own audit documentation and audit procedures. Okay, so that is the first part of our audit documentation topic. So the other topic under this will be discussed in the next video lectures.